recently joined a homeowners association meeting in Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood where residents reported a YouTuber had been harassing people.
Something went down in the Catalina foothills on April 13, 2026, and it is something everyone following this case needs to hear right now. The Pima County Sheriff's Office ended up sending a whole new wave of deputies back to Nancy's block. More patrols and a much heavier police presence right on the street where this whole thing started. The true crime crowd that's been obsessing over this investigation picked up on it within hours. Everyone jumped to the same conclusion immediately, that there was a fresh lead or some big break that forced the cops back to that street so fast. But that guess was wrong. Just a reminder, we're looking at an active missing person case here. All the info I'm sharing comes straight from verified news reports and official police statements. Nobody mentioned in this video is being charged with a crime unless I specifically say so. You have to understand, the Catalina foothills isn't exactly built for the spotlight. It's located just north of Tucson in an unincorporated part of Pima County. Basically, a bunch of expensive homes tucked into the desert at the base of the mountains. Wide roads, huge lots, and residents who moved there specifically to get away from the city noise and be left alone. They wanted to escape the crowded feel of Tucson proper, and they definitely didn't want the kind of foot traffic or attention you'd find downtown. Nancy Guthrie moved there for those exact same reasons. Her house was her sanctuary, a life focused on keeping things private, being with family, and enjoying the kind of quiet retirement people work their whole lives to get. All that peace and quiet ended early on the morning of February 1st, 2026. When the Pima County Sheriff's team first started canvassing the neighborhood during the start of the search, they actually found exactly what every detective hopes for in those first 72 hours. Neighbors who wanted to help, clear security camera footage, and locals close enough to the scene to remember those tiny details that sometimes crack a case. What nobody saw coming, not the detectives, not the neighbors, and definitely not the Guthries, was how things would change as days turned into weeks, and then a month. Suddenly, the investigation wasn't leading to any arrests. There were no named suspects, and Sheriff Chris Nanos hadn't given a real public update since February 5th. While that silence dragged on, this quiet community the cops were trying to protect basically turned into a fishbowl for the internet. The attention was impossible to miss. News vans were parked all over the street since day one. FBI agents were out there going door to door through the whole neighborhood. By the end of the first week, drone shots of the house were already viral on social media. Once the total reward money hit over $1 million, it started drawing in a very specific kind of person. The type who treats following a case like a massive research project. People who build these intense timelines, rewatching FBI surveillance clips 100 times just to find something the official reports might have missed, and who eventually decide to just book a flight to Tucson to see the street for themselves. Now, some of those people went because they really care about an 84-year-old woman who's still missing. Others? They just went for the content. It's getting harder and harder to tell those two groups apart from the outside. Things were messy from the start, and they didn't get any clearer over the 72 days that followed. To really get the weight of what the Sheriff's Office announced on April 13th, you've got to understand what those 72 days actually looked like on the ground, both for the people in that neighborhood and the ones deep inside the investigation. This case blew up online and stayed there for a long time. Honestly, the reason why isn't exactly a mystery. Nancy Guthrie, she is 84, is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the famous co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. Savannah is easily one of the most recognizable faces in morning television. So, it was huge news when her mom just vanished from her Catalina foothills home early on February 1st, right after spending the night with her other daughter, Annie. This story didn't need some algorithm to find an audience. The audience was already waiting. The real question was what, if anything, the investigation would actually give them to go on. Over the next few weeks, the Sheriff's Department put out updates that, honestly, just left people with more questions. They confirmed they found blood belonging to Nancy right there on her front porch. Then, there was the security video the FBI put out on February 10th. It showed a masked man with a weapon standing right on her doorstep just hours before she went missing. The FBI even gave a description of the guy they were looking for. A male between 5'9" and 5'10", average build, carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack, the cheap kind Walmart sells for under $11. That description was specific enough to go viral, but vague enough to describe tens of thousands of random men. At the time, it was the most solid lead the investigation had produced that the public could actually do something with. But weeks went by, and it didn't lead to a single arrest. They found a glove about 2 miles from Nancy's home and pulled some DNA off it. They ran it through the national database, but it was a total dead end. No matches at all. Sheriff Nanos told the press that a private lab down in Florida was trying to untangle mixed DNA samples from the crime scene, but they'd run into what he called a snag. Look, DNA is just like anything else. You need enough markers to actually make a match. It is a whole comparative process. Sometimes samples are messy or mixed. We have DNA from that scene that is a mixture, so we have to split them apart. I am just hoping the lab can pull it off. And then the reward money climbed past $1 million. Tips started pouring in by the tens of thousands. The FBI confirmed over 13,000 in the first 2 weeks alone, and that number just kept growing. Still, that masked guy in the video? No one could identify him. That February 5th press conference, the final one Nanos would give, left the public with a case that had plenty of physical evidence, a photo of a suspect, and a massive 7-figure reward on the table. But what they didn't have was an arrest. And for the next 67 days, the man leading the investigation didn't give a single meaningful update. When things get that quiet, the people following the case online did what these communities always do when the official channels go silent. They just started filling in the blanks themselves. The massive true crime following around the Nancy Guthrie case wasn't because of one person's decision. It came together because every single part of the story felt like a beacon for people who track these cases. You had a high-profile victim and that massive national family link. The scene was messy, packed with physical clues that basically flew in the face of everything the cops were saying. Then you had that grainy video of a masked, armed intruder. It was sharp enough to obsess over, yet vague enough to spark a dozen different wild theories. Plus, there's that reward, over $1 million, just sitting there totally unclaimed, not for lack of trying, but because the key piece of the puzzle was still missing. And the guy in charge? The lead detective went totally silent after February. No more mics, no more updates. Nothing. See, these specific ingredients are exactly what the true crime world has been trained to sniff out and devour over the years. When they all collide in one case, the internet basically explodes. It's not just a modest reaction. Countless clips about Nancy Guthrie's murder racked up tens of millions of views in just the first month. Subreddits dedicated to the whole thing blew up to tens of thousands of members. They cataloged every tiny bit of evidence they could find, scrutinizing those FBI surveillance stills side by side, arguing over what those SOTUS results actually meant, and tracking every single syllable from the Pima County Sheriff since February 1st. Big YouTube channels, who usually did other cases, suddenly made Guthrie their full-time job. A few were veterans who'd been at this for a long time, folks who actually understood the lines you shouldn't cross when a case is still active, and who'd seen enough to know the difference between smart analysis and reckless rumors that ruin lives. But then you had the rookies, just chasing the massive traffic, playing fast and loose without any real ethical boundaries. It's hard to say exactly how many creators actually packed their bags and headed to Tucson, but one thing is certain: enough people showed up and enough of them acted out that local HOAs started freaking out. They took their complaints straight to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Honestly, the cops were so overwhelmed they had to send deputies out to babysit 2 different neighborhoods just to manage the chaos the internet caused. Nobody in the community planned for that mess, but that's exactly what happened. See, there's this massive ongoing debate about whether physically being at a crime scene actually helps anything. The people who say, go, usually lean on a few big ideas. 1. Keeping the spotlight on the case keeps the heat on the police. 2. Getting your own. Eyes on the ground can catch things the official reports somehow gloss over. And 3. If people think the investigation is stuck, Being there is a way for citizens to keep an eye on a system that usually answers to no one. Supporters point to real cases where cops just gave up. The story faded away, and the only reason they were solved was because outsiders refused to let it go. Sometimes it's a podcaster, a YouTuber, or an indie reporter finding something new in a file that's been gathering dust for 10 years. The Nancy Guthrie matter hadn't hit that point yet. It was live. The FBI was helping. Hundreds of cops were still dedicated to the hunt. However, that mindset that brought creators to Tucson didn't just happen by accident. It grew out of 67 days of dead air between Nano's briefing and the patrol news. A $1 million reward sitting there totally untouched fueled it. Between the CODIS database coming up dry and that DNA laboratory down in Florida hitting a wall, plus that masked man footage which sparked thousands of tips but yielded absolutely zero public arrests. One ex-FBI pro named Jennifer Coffender told Newsweek right after the announcement how much stress this puts on the local neighborhoods stuck in the middle. She pointed out that locals definitely don't all feel the same way about these creators. To some, having them around feels like a needed bit of pressure. If people are watching, the story stays alive and doesn't just disappear. There are folks who honestly think the chaos is worth the payoff. Then others feel hunted, cornered without permission, recorded when they don't want to be, and judged by random people with zero authority and no rules about where that footage ends up. These two vibes clash in the same streets, and honestly, both sides have a point. People in the Catalina foothills aren't all singing from the same hymn sheet here. The case for telling everyone to leave is actually pretty straightforward. Homes shouldn't be treated like public crime labs. The families who reside in the foothills never signed up to be the backdrop of a viral mystery. They'd already been dealing with FBI and local sheriff activity since February 1st. Just imagine drones hovering over your neighbor's chimney all day. Their quiet roads turned into one-way lanes just to manage all the sudden tourists. Now they've got a constant crowd of camera-happy strangers with no real purpose. Eventually, having a lens pointed at you stops being about justice or holding people accountable. It becomes purely about squeezing people who did nothing wrong and shouldn't have to put up with it for months on end. That HOA meeting showed with crystal clarity exactly when enough was enough. Usually, a neighborhood board meeting isn't. The place where major abduction cases meet the world of internet creators. But this Nancy Guthrie situation had created a weird kind of mess that the local HOA simply couldn't handle without calling in the police. The Pima County Sheriff's Office told News for Tucson on April 13, 2026, that they'd been at a neighborhood HOA gathering in the foothills purely to handle some serious gripes from residents about the recent circus on their streets. They popped into an HOA meeting near Nancy Guthrie's place because locals said some YouTuber was being a total jerk. The county deputies mentioned they heard the exact same thing from the area where Guthrie's daughter Annie lives, so they're stepping up patrols in both spots. Now, the specific issue that kicked off this whole HOA drama and police response wasn't even about the actual case. This wasn't about finding a fresh suspect, or some mystery car, or anything actually tied to Nancy Guthrie's case from February 1st. Instead, it was about a YouTuber who was harassing people in the neighborhood. The sheriff's department told KVOA as much. They haven't named the creator, and since it's not public knowledge, we won't be using any names here either. We do know things went way too far. These residents had been living right next to a major crime scene for 2.5 months, dealing with constant cameras and news crews outside, police everywhere, and random looky-loos, and they finally hit a breaking point. They went to their HOA first, then directly to the sheriff. You don't take those steps over something small. Cops don't show up at an HOA meeting just because some guy was standing on a sidewalk or filming from the street corner. This formal grievance detailed behavior that was way too targeted and frequent to ignore, demanding a real response from the county's top law enforcement office. The sheriff's department doesn't send deputies to neighbor meetings just for fun. The fact they were there, listened to the concerns, and then agreed to put more boots on the ground says a lot about how serious the situation was and what the department felt they actually needed to do about it. This wasn't just being careful. It was a reaction to behavior that neighbors tracked and reported up the chain until they reached the sheriff's office. And the Catalina foothills wasn't the only spot getting extra patrols. The Pima County Sheriff's Office also told Tucson News they had the same kinds of reports from Annie Guthrie, Nancy's daughter. She stays in a different part of town on the other side of Tucson. Because she spoke up too, they ramped up security in that area. This whole situation, in Annie's neighborhood, means they are now watching both spots more closely, specifically around where Annie and her husband live. This part of the story is actually a huge deal, even if most reports missed it. See, Annie was with her mom on the night of January 31st. She's one of the last people to have seen Nancy before she vanished. Both her and her husband's names have been tossed around constantly in all those online forums and comment sections and YouTube clips, as people try to fill in the blanks since there haven't been any arrests yet. To be clear, Annie hasn't been charged with anything. Neither has her husband. Not with a single thing. We aren't calling them persons of interest here either. Still, the fact that internet sleuths seem to be literally showing up in the neighborhood where Annie lives, and that it got so bad that she had to file an actual report with the sheriff's office, and for the cops to actually step up patrols, that's about more than just managing staff. It shows that the internet's obsession had moved past the crime scene and straight into the victim's daughter's personal life. Annie's been stuck in this nightmare since February 1st. She's the one whose mother never made it back. She stood by as the police search failed to find a suspect. She was actually one of the last people to see her mom alive. That reality stayed with her every single day of the 72 since the case began. Sometime during those 72 days, someone showed up in her neighborhood. What happened then was scary enough for her to call the sheriff's office. The department handled that report seriously enough to send more patrol cars to her street. Cops were now keeping an eye on two different Tucson areas, not because they had any new leads in either neighborhood, but because the internet circus surrounding this case had become a major policing issue in both spots. The data, tied to the Nancy Guthrie probe, is massive and shouldn't be ignored. Back in February, Sheriff Nanos told Fox 10 that he had 400 people working the case on the ground. "My team has 400 people out there today who started their morning, with the hope and the prayer that they'd finally find Nancy." Later, the department told the New York Post that roughly 300 to 400 personnel were still on the job in those early weeks, matching the same intensity as the initial search. By March 2026, that force was trimmed down to 20 or 24 investigators working the file full-time. Reports from News Nation's Brian Enton and CNN show the natural cycle of how these huge investigations usually play out, starting with a surge, followed by a shift to evidence work, and a permanent team to carry the case forward long-term. Those task force members aren't just coming from a bottomless pool of talent. Since Pima County Sheriff's Department covers a region with well over 1 million people, every detective assigned here is a detective missing from somewhere else in the city. Despite the heavy lab analysis, FBI help, and a tip line that logged tens of thousands of calls in just a few weeks, the choice to put extra patrol units in two quiet neighborhoods for reasons unrelated to the crime itself isn't necessarily a massive waste of resources. Patrol officers and detectives simply do two very different things. Stepping up security in the Catalina foothills and near Annie, Guthrie's place doesn't pull lead detectives off the case, but it clearly does something else entirely. It proves for the record that the Pima County Sheriff's Department is now managing the messy side. Effects of internet true crime fame as an official duty, including neighborhood meetings, public liaisons, security shifts, and documented police action. This is a heavy new burden for an agency already dealing with a leadership disaster that, on its own, would normally be the only thing anyone talked about for an entire year. Sheriff Chris Nanos gave his last update on the Nancy Guthrie case on February 5, 2026. That was 67 days before those extra neighborhood patrols were even announced. Between that February press briefing and April 13th, the case for Nancy Guthrie stayed cold. No one was arrested. The public received zero updates that actually suggested they were any closer to finding her. What went on inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department during those 67 days wasn't exactly quiet, but it certainly wasn't about Nancy. Come March 2026, papers surfaced about Nanos's past employment, specifically his stint with the El Paso police between 1976 and 1982. Those old records, uncovered by the Arizona Republic, included claims that Nanos hit a guy in handcuffs with his flashlight back in El Paso. That incident apparently earned him a suspension, though no criminal charges followed. Paperwork from July 21, 1982, showed El Paso had officially logged 2 major complaints against him, being insubordinate and what they called a consistent lack of efficiency. He ended up resigning on August 3rd that year rather than being fired. When Pima County hired him in 1984, he conveniently left those disciplinary marks off his job application. Supervisor Matt Hines, who'd been very vocal about wanting Nanos to quit, tore into the issue at the April 7th board meeting. He made it clear that Nanos's entire 42-year run with the county looked like it was built on a very shaky foundation. He said it flat out in public. You cannot lie on an application. You cannot lie under oath. He mentioned that these findings weren't just some small clerical error from 4 decades ago. It was the very reason Nanos was able to keep his job all these years. On April 7, 2026, the Pima County Board voted unanimously to formally force Nanos to provide a sworn statement, written or in person, regarding 4 specific topics. His time in El Paso and exactly why he left, how he disciplined Lieutenant Heather Lapin and Sergeant Aaron Cross, moves an independent audit claimed were purely political during the 2024 election season, his department's interactions with federal immigration agents, and finally, the fact that the department consistently spent more money than the board ever actually approved. The board gets the power to demand that testimony from Arizona Revised Statute 11-253, which gives county supervisors the legal right to ask for sworn reports from officers about how they handle their duties. If he doesn't cooperate, he could be kicked out of office. Hines didn't sugarcoat it. The board is fully within its rights to fire Nanos if he ignores the statute. A spokesperson for the department said Nanos plans to talk once they finalize the scope. That specific phrase, once the scope is finalized, raised quite a few eyebrows for those watching. Nanos has until April 21, 2026 to get his testimony in. That April 21st meeting is going to be massive, and not just because of his resume. Even his own guys, specifically the Pima County Deputies Organization, are waiting to see what happens. Before that April 7th board meeting, everyone had already voted. No confidence in Nanos. Organizers were already pushing a recall, scrambling to hit the legal mark of 122,211 signatures, aiming for 135,000 before the July 10th deadline. The board had previously agreed to pull in the Arizona Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney to look into Nanos and how he handled the 2024 election after he decided to bench his rival, Lieutenant Heather Lapin, on administrative leave only weeks before the polls even opened. That specific Attorney General probe flagged some policy breaks but didn't find anything criminal. Then there was the separate Pima County HR investigation, which finally went public in April 2026, and it basically said, Nanos and his top brass definitely abused their power for politics during that same race. Lieutenant Heather Lapin, who lost that 2024 election by less than 500 votes, a razor-thin margin that forced a total recount, hit the department with a $2 million notice of claim, claiming the disciplinary stuff during her campaign was just a play to tilt the election results. Every one of these issues is hitting at the exact same time. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is currently being steered through the most intense investigation in years by a sheriff whose very position is now being challenged by a unanimous board demand, a major lawsuit from a former employee, a recall effort backed by the public, a no-confidence vote from his own deputies, plus that Attorney General referral. Why that April 13th patrol news matters here is because of what it says about the climate where this investigation is happening. Think about it. A department feeling this much heat suddenly sent patrol units into 2 specific neighborhoods just 5 days before its leaders had to testify under oath. And for reasons that had nothing to do with the original investigation those officers were supposed to be helping. I'm not saying the patrol call was wrong on its own. The harassment claims were legitimate and needed a response. but it shows a department stretched thin, trying to manage chaos from every side with limited resources and a leadership group that the people working under them have said, on the record, they no longer trust. There is a certain kind of missing persons case that just hits differently than all the others. It's not the one you see most often. It's not even the type that gets the most police focus when you look at the thousands of reports people file across the country every single year. It's a specific situation created by a perfect storm. The victim's profile, some video evidence being available, no one getting arrested right away, and a family member with a massive platform who can turn a local search into a huge national event. The Nancy Guthrie case is exactly that. What actually happens to a case once it hits that level isn't something people really study or understand, at least not the people watching it from the sidelines. Dealing with a massive flood of tips is a logistical nightmare. The PCSD and FBI got over 13,000 in just the first 2 weeks, and every single one has to be checked, logged, and vetted for potential leads. That's a lot of grunt work that people outside of police circles rarely think about when they're reporting a tip or telling others to call the hotline. 13,000 leads isn't some gift. It's a massive burden. It's a mountain of data that investigators have to sift through just to find the tiny fraction that's actually useful. The media creates a whole other mess. Detectives working the actual scene can't move an inch when news crews are camped out right at the yellow tape. Witnesses who might have talked to the cops suddenly get cold feet once they realize anything they say near a microphone could be blasted all over the internet within a few hours. Physical clues, the layout of the street, where the cameras are pointed, even the sight lines from the back alleys, basically become public info once the detailed news footage starts making rounds, which lets a suspect figure out exactly what the police might have on film. Then there's the next wave. The true crime creators who don't show up early, when cops are everywhere and the neighborhood is on high alert and full of activity, but weeks later, after the news vans have finally packed up, when the FBI is gone and the street is finally starting to feel a little bit normal again. That wave is what caused that HOA meeting. That's why the sheriff's department had to show up too. And that's why we're seeing more patrols in 2 Tucson neighborhoods 72 days into a kidnapping case. The Catalina Foothills mess isn't the first time this happened. It definitely won't be the last. But it's a clear case of a police department formally dealing with the fallout of online true crime sleuths as part of their daily patrol duties. And this is all happening while the primary kidnapping investigation hasn't even led to an arrest, and the lead agency is juggling a massive political and legal disaster at the very top of their ranks. These things are connected. The true crime crowd following Nancy Guthrie's case did some good alongside the chaos. They built timelines with a level of detail that even the local news couldn't match. They caught every single slip-up in the official police statements. The suspect's description was checked against every public record out there, showing what deep-dive community research can actually look like. Some people have lived this case since day one and know the security footage, the forensic evidence, the DNA results, and the whole timeline better than most reporters who flew in for a week and then bailed when they realized there wasn't going to be an immediate arrest. But also, you've got people naming random civilians as suspects in videos without a shred of proof, tying specific names to wild theories and blasting it out to hundreds of thousands of followers without the ethics or legal rules of real journalism. You've got these people who head up to the Catalina Foothills and act like they're doing investigative journalism, while they're really just hounding the neighbors for interviews. Honestly, those neighbors didn't owe them anything and had zero interest in talking to them. Then you have others, who literally tracked Annie Guthrie's every move and hovered around her street until she finally had to call the sheriff's department. Yet everyone gets hit with the same label, the true crime community. You see it in the same comment sections on the same apps, all pushed by those same social media algorithms. That HOA meeting finally singled one person out of that group in a way that was very real, well documented, and had actual consequences. It didn't solve the bigger question of how the true crime community should actually behave during an active investigation. That's an issue that started way before this case, and it's definitely going to outlast it. But it did show that there's a limit, something weeks of arguing back and forth online never managed to do. 1. Single person's actions in that one specific neighborhood led to a formal police report being filed. The sheriff getting involved and extra patrols hitting the streets in 2 different areas. That kind of specific action isn't just noise. It tells you that there is a real line, and that at least one person crossed it so far that the residents of the Catalina foothills decided they'd had enough. Nancy Guthrie still hasn't been found. There is still no suspect who has been publicly named. No one has been arrested. That blood they found right on her front porch? It's definitely hers. The guy in the mask, caught on her Nest cam just before she disappeared, still hasn't been identified. There was a glove found about 2 miles away, but the DNA on it didn't match anyone in the national database at first. Turns out it belonged to a local restaurant worker, but they cleared him of any involvement pretty quickly. That reward, which is over $1 million, is still just sitting there. They have waded through tens of thousands of different tips. Still, not one lead has led to an arrest or told the public what really happened in those early hours of February 1st. Based on the evidence that has been released, here is what we know. Nancy was last seen at her place on the evening of January 31st. Her pacemaker last synced with her Apple devices at around 2:28 that morning on February 1st. According to the sheriff's official timeline, her relatives dialed 911 at 12:03 that afternoon because she never showed up for her online church service with her friends. They found blood right there on the front porch. That Nest camera picked up a guy with a mask and a weapon just hours before the family called the cops. The FBI checked it out and confirmed that the man was definitely on her property. They also found a glove with DNA about 2 miles down the road. Like I said, that DNA didn't hit anything in the national system initially. When they finally tracked that DNA to a local guy working at a restaurant, he was ruled out of the case completely. A Ring camera, roughly 2.5 miles from the house on a back road headed toward east. River Road caught some car footage in the early hours of February 1st that investigators spent time reviewing. But still, no one was arrested. Every single piece of evidence we've seen points to this being a total setup. A planned, calculated move by someone who knew the layout. They knew the neighborhood. They knew where the cameras were, even messed with one, and were ready in a way that proves this wasn't just some random crime. You have that Walmart backpack and the mask hitting in those quiet hours before dawn. The guy in the video clearly knew what he was doing and still hasn't been caught. The sheriff's department is still digging through the DNA and other lab samples they pulled from the scene. Those genetic profiles they found at the house? They're still being processed in the lab right now. Just how many people were involved, or what those results actually prove, is still a secret part of the case and hasn't been shared with anyone yet. When he was grilled in public about people wanting him to resign, Nanos just brushed it off as background noise, insisting his team hasn't made a single mistake so far. But the town's trust is basically at rock bottom, regardless of how much he tries to reassure everyone. And the people still have zero clue if the cops are close to an arrest or if they're completely stuck. Savannah Guthrie finally sat back down at the Today Show anchor desk on April 6, 2026. It was her first time back since her mother vanished 64 days ago. Her family put out a statement back in March that really just repeated what they've been saying all along. They still firmly believe that someone in Tucson or the surrounding area holds the missing piece to solving this whole thing. They haven't given up on that idea, and the detectives are still out there working the case. What has shifted, though, is the whole circus surrounding the search. This investigation is moving forward while the department is drowning in legal deadlines and forced testimonies. A vote from the deputies union saying they don't trust the boss, a $2 million lawsuit, a recall effort, and now cops having to deal with online trolls harassing people in 2 different Tucson neighborhoods. It is a total mess. Running a massive missing person search in the middle of all that drama is unheard of. But look, none of that political noise changes the one truth at the heart of this. A woman has been gone for 72 days. Her family is still praying for her to just walk through. The door and the person who took her is still out there somewhere. This whole investigation will be judged on one thing: whether they find Nancy Guthrie. None of the petty office politics at the Pima County Sheriff's Department is going to change that final verdict. If you know anything, even a tiny detail that feels like nothing, please help us out. Call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or drop a tip at tips.fbi.gov. The Sheriff's Department. actually had to put more patrols in Nancy and Annie Guthrie's neighborhoods because people living there, including Annie Guthrie herself, started calling the cops about the creepy behavior of at least one person who showed up in person because they followed the case on the internet. A specific YouTuber was named in those reports as the main reason for that emergency HOA meeting and the heavy police presence that followed. Now, the department is basically babysitting 2 different residential blocks in Tucson, not because they found a new lead or some groundbreaking evidence, but because the online obsession with this case is spilling over into real life. That's the real story. No big breaks, no new clues about where Nancy might be, just a police response that shows you exactly how chaotic things are at the 72-day mark. It's active, still wide open, and now it's causing its own set of problems for cops on opposite sides of town. Just think about what that actually means for a second. The hunt for this woman, who was 84 and vanished from home before dawn on February 1st, has now blown up so much that police are now handling a completely different situation, out in quiet neighborhoods where there actually isn't even anything new to report yet. Look, the people living there aren't the suspects. They aren't witnesses hiding some big secret either. They're just neighbors who have spent 2 months living next to a cold case and all the online chaos that comes with it. Things got so intense that some neighbors asked the cops to show up at their meetings and start driving past their houses more often. That doesn't mean the investigation failed. It's just where things stand now, and honestly, it's what happens with these big, high-profile cases in today's world where every single detail is picked apart online. The way we watch crimes get solved in public has changed forever. Seeing more patrol cars didn't actually find Nancy Guthrie, though. The real work is still being handled behind the scenes by the FBI and local police. That masked guy in the video? Still the main suspect. The tip line? Still wide open. Nobody has claimed the reward yet because the one call that changes everything just hasn't happened. We've been on this case since February 1st. Every single thing that actually gets verified, every real update from the cops, and every legal shift in this whole mess, we're covering all of it as it breaks. Those extra patrols are just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle, and we are far from finished. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. This case is moving fast, and we're not planning on falling behind. Everything you're seeing here comes from real news reports and verified sources, actual police statements, and records current through April 16, 2026. This whole project is strictly for sharing information and educational use. Unless we specifically say otherwise, no one mentioned here has been charged with any crime. We aren't here to point fingers or guess who might be involved in Nancy's disappearance, so please don't take anything in this video as an accusation against anyone. Things change after these videos go live. What you're hearing is based only on what we knew when we filmed this. If you know anything about where Nancy Guthrie might be, please call 1-800-CALL-FBI or go to tips.fbi.gov. Tonight, the search for Nancy Guthrie feels closer and yet more uncertain than ever. The renewed police presence didn't bring answers, but it did something just as powerful. It reminded everyone that this case is far from over. Behind the quiet streets and guarded doors, tension is rising. Every movement, every detail, every whisper could matter. Investigators are still watching, still piecing together a truth that refuses to surface easily. And somewhere in all of this, there is an answer waiting to be found. Until that moment comes, the question remains, what really happened to Nancy?